what's happening is the bottom line across the world is something really simple. We don't have enough decent jobs, and as a result, we don't have robust livelihoods. You have a growing middle class, but you also have large populations.
So, Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, you're the president and CEO of the African Centre for Economic Transformation, ACET, really well-known policy institute, really Africa's leading economic policy institute, certainly all over the place in terms of your presence in the major discussions of our time on the future of cooperation, and that's what this podcast's about. I first met you in Save the Children, but you were there at the beginning of DFID, we've just established, which we can talk about, a really major moment in the history of international development cooperation. And then I met you when you were at Save the Children, leading work on health, and we talked a lot about the role of the private sector at that time. And I'd be interested to go there again, actually, and see what you're thinking about that and what we've all kind of learned about what it can and can't do. And now, of course, you're at ACET, and the other thing that we did together a few years ago is we set up the Global Public Investment Network, and that's also kind of an interesting thing to be talking about. Everyone is talking about the future of international development cooperation. And I wonder, Mavis, just as a first question, how different, maybe this is a silly question, maybe it's just so obvious, but how different is the moment now than the previous, I guess, 2 or 3 decades where both of us have been engaged in this world of international development cooperation?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. So, when I think about this moment compared to when I started my career in 1997, as you rightly pointed out, I think the thing that is really striking is how different the world is, and I don't think at that point we had taken time to stop and think about how the world was changing. We were very focused on a period of intense poverty, starvation, what we called an unfair global system, the fact that, children were starving in parts of Africa, kids in Asia were not going to school, China was poor. I don't think any of us at that time actually stopped and reflected really carefully on what was happening in the world beyond those, striking poverty issues. And today we are being forced to stop and think about what is changing in the world for so many reasons. So let's think about it. Today we are in a world where China is really powerful. Okay. The last time a country was this powerful was like 200 years ago. Okay. We are in a world where of Europe are at war. Last time we saw warfare in Europe, the 1940s. We are at a point of popularism. I mean, we've seen popularism, we saw popularism in the 1970s, but we've seen this depth of popularism and sexism and racism like we saw in the 1930s that led to the European wars in the 1940s, etc. And, money, where does the money sit? Doesn't sit in the places where we think it should sit. In the late 90s and early noughties, the money sat in the global majority, and at the time it was defined as the North. Yeah. It's just this major change that is going on, and let's not even talk about this digital thing. When you and I were young, we just about picked up on the computer era. Now we are doing AI. Can you imagine? We didn't have these things. We now have kids who look at our mobile phones and think it is the weirdest thing ever. So, and then we have the usual things. Population growth. Poverty is still there. There are wars still going on. There are all these other problems that existed in the late 90s, early noughties, alongside these seismic shifts going on, which means that the money we took for granted is not available, it's not as flexible. Countries have moved on. They are not dependent so heavily on development assistance. We're talking about a time when countries had 30 for 40% of their national domestic revenue coming from development assistance. We're talking about now an average of 3 to 5% in most African countries. The world has just shifted. Africa has a middle class. Shock horror. People go to South Asia to get digital experts. Shock horror. It's a different world.
Yeah. And I've been living a lot of the last couple of decades, as you know, in Latin America,
Mm-hmm.
where, things have changed so much as well. And I guess, with a lot
Mm-hmm.
of focus at the moment on the global north, on Europe and North America and all the changes
Mm-hmm.
there, focus on China, of course, huge shifts there.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that? And you said that, when DFID was set up in the late 90s, the focus so much on poverty. The whole point of that was to focus on poverty
Mm-hmm.
and nothing else. And it feels like that
Mm-hmm.
was a good and kind and thoughtful decision at the time, but it feels like that's not where we're at the moment. But would you say that
Yeah.
poverty is not such a major issue as it was 30 years ago? Has Africa got richer in a serious way?
It depends on how you define wealth. Okay. Yes, Africa has gotten richer, but inequity, okay, and high Gini coefficient, high inequality means that Africa hasn't gotten richer, if that makes sense. So you have a certain percentage of Africans who are doing really well. You have a growing middle class, but you also have large populations that are not doing well, that are not benefiting from growth. And there is the problem. So Africa has grown, Africa is wealthier, but Africa has not transformed. That growth and wealth has been capitalized by parts of the global north and a small percentage of Africans. So for me, if you ask me, is Africa wealthy? My answer is no, because wealth has to be equitably distributed for enough people to benefit. Look, I'm not naive enough to say 100% should benefit. You and I are, tried and tested Brits. 100% of Britain is not benefiting from Britain's wealth. But, it has to be substantially broader than what we have now.
Yeah, and looking back at that time, it was like Diffid was. We keep on going back to that moment because it's actually a really fascinating moment. It was 10 years
Yeah.
after Live Aid, this
Yeah.
huge focus on kind of
Mm-hmm.
devastating poverty, and then you had Diffid and other organisations saying, right, it's all about poverty. The World Bank at that time said, it's a poverty focus, and then for the next 5, 10 years, 15 years maybe, and then it started to
Mm-hmm.
shift. Do you think we were wrong, or the sector, the international development sector, was wrong to focus in that way on poverty? Because you implied in your earlier remarks that we kind of weren't necessarily seeing the bigger picture in that focus. Because some people, as we think about the future, are saying, look, we need to get back to that focus. Stop with the distraction. Let's focus on poverty again.
I disagree. I mean, Jonathan, you knew me in those days, and I was a big believer in, you need to increase the size of the cake for you to be able to share it effectively. So I wouldn't say we were entirely wrong to focus on poverty, because we're talking at a period where we needed to get kids in schools. We needed to get health facilities that were working. We needed, the system was so out of kilter that you couldn't grow without the skills, you couldn't grow without a health system. You needed those systems, but we swung the pendulum so far that I remember, it was evil to talk about growth. It was evil to talk about transformation. People like me were evil when we talked to the private sector, and I think that is the fundamental challenge, because there was this implicit assumption that the money would keep flowing. Now, anybody who has looked at history tells you there are peaks and troughs. There are peaks of wealth, troughs of poverty. It's just economics, base economics 101. So what we should have done was we should have balanced the investment in poverty reduction initiatives, social initiatives, with economic growth and transformation investments. Okay. And there were so many people in the industry who felt that growth and transformation were evil. Business was evil. We didn't stop to think about what growth and transformation did for Europe, North America, what it's doing for China, what it's doing for Southeast Asia. We didn't stop. I find it ironic now that, the bank is in its latest industrialization paper is talking about all these countries in Southeast Asia that were seen as terrible pathways. Now they are the pathways we must look for. So, we were not wrong, but where we went wrong was in our failure to balance.
Yeah,
That's what I would say.
I was just saying the perspectives you have sitting and
Uh-huh.
working in the global south are so different to the
Uh-huh.
discussions that you end up in inevitably all the time in London, Paris, and
Mm-hmm.
New York and Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder how that's affected your thinking over the last few years.
Okay, so I would say that, and as I was saying earlier on, the thing that has not shifted is right from the beginning. I've always been a big believer in economic development and economic transformation as a critical part of every country's development agenda. I don't think that has shifted. What I think has shifted is less the what and more the how. Okay. Sitting in Accra focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, I am realizing that, development is more complex and more nuanced than the development community likes to feel comfortable with. It means that it's not necessarily about adoption of models. It's about a lot of adaptation. It's about taking time to understand the system within which you are operating in and really tweaking and adapting and evolving, okay, for growth to happen. So I think if I were to pick the thing that has changed the most for me is really on the how. So let me just give you a few examples. Once upon a time, I used to be this incredible believer in institutional reforms. I think you get civil service reform right, you get institutions right, and then development will happen. Actually, I don't think it's necessary. Institutions matter, but you don't need institutions to be perfect before development happens. If communities and societies and businesses have the room to experiment and grow and develop and thrive, they can actually generate opportunities that will drive institutional reform because institutions will be forced to reform to manage those systems and processes. And I think that's probably one of the biggest shifts in my thinking since I've been here. The other thing that's been really striking for me is look, I came from the UK development world. I was a UK civil servant. I was a big believer in certain models, approaches, etc. Coming back to Africa, I'm realizing that through the development paradigm and through the transition that a lot of countries made in post-colonialism, they have lost or ignored a whole sector of society, traditional leaders, community systems, structures that are so critical to development. And they continue to have a fundamental impact on development. So let me give you a couple of examples. I'm sitting in Ghana. We do a lot of work at the central government level, okay? Powerful, really improve powerful work. And then you go to the local government level and it doesn't translate to results. And you're like, why doesn't it translate to results? So you start to unpack and you realize that your local government leader or your local district authority cannot be appointed by the president without the approval of the chieftaincies. And once they get there, the chiefs are really powerful. So if you build an institutional mechanism that doesn't take that system into account, it's failed even before it's begun. Okay. And so there are so many normative, structural systems that we haven't factored into the development paradigm. And that's why we can't progress. We take two steps forward, one step back.
So that's so interesting. So you've been in these, all of this year, there've just been endless conferences about
Mhm.
what's the future of international development cooperation. People are starting to talk about a quote post aid world. We've been talking about
Mm,
it for ages, but people kind of catching up,
mhm,
especially the Ghanaian government has been talking about it for ages as
mhm,
well. And so I guess my question to you is kind of strutting the floors in these conferences, which are often in the global north. What do you think that I guess, the North development community is getting right at the moment? Has it kind of realized some good stuff? And what do you think it's getting wrong? Stuff that it just still can't
mm,
get. And then maybe there's nothing
mhm.
in one of those categories that you can think of. I don't know. But I mean, in either one, what's it really getting right and what's it really getting wrong?
So I think the first thing it is getting right is an acknowledgement that development is not bankrolled. It's not like our money drives everything. I think that there is an increasing acknowledgement that our money cannot drive anything. Okay. So I think that is really important. The fact that that is beginning to sink home is really helpful. The fact that they are talking honestly about mutual interest is also very, very important. I think where it is getting wrong is that there's a part of it that sounds quite patronizing and naive. We are talking about our mutual interest, but we send you the text of mutual interest. That's not mutual interest. That is what you think you can do in this space and what you want. And you've somehow identified our development and dovetailed it. That's not mutual
Yeah.
interest. So I think that first and foremost, that's wrong. They are getting that very wrong. The other thing that I think they are getting very wrong is the assumption that, they're going to provide TA, technical assistance. And this is it. Technical assistance does not come from the global minority. Technical assistance is a global thing. Africa has the agency to get technical assistance from anywhere. And, I'm not an African president, but if I was an African president, I would really think twice before I go to the UK or the US for advice on industrialization. Just simply because they industrialized in a time that is like so outdated. What have they got to teach me about industrialization today? It's a different kettle of fish. So I'll look elsewhere for my models. So the assumption that they have, there is still this perception that having advanced technology equals having access to technical advice that Africa needs. And it's often forgotten, yeah, that innovation and invention, okay, is the mother of necessity. A lot of inventions are happening right now because Africa needs it. So I think that you know, there has to be a more mature approach to this. And I would say the third thing that they are getting wrong is there is this perception of where Africa aligns, like there is this sense that Africa will vote with you or Africa will align with you for a little bit of money, etc. And I think that there is a lot of thought going into the choices Africa is making itself. Africa is making its own choices. When a country descends in Europe to have a conversation, they are descending to get what they want. And they'll come back and, the more mature countries that we are seeing.
Yeah. It's that particular conversation that takes place in a particular context, but the global north thinks that is the conversation, and it's not. That's like a
No, yeah.
tiny part of
It's
it.
not. It's not. It's a tiny part of it. So I think that is the thing that is shifting. And so what I'm seeing, which I'm really excited about, and look, this is by no means standardized across the continent. What I'm seeing that really excites me about the continent is, I would say, three things. The first thing is the conversation about what do we do for ourselves? And how do we collaborate to do it? So a couple of weeks ago at the African Development Bank annual meetings, the whole conversation was about NAFAD, the new Africa Finance development framework that the bank has launched, and everybody was behind it. And the conversation is not just regional institutions, it's domestic to sub-regional to regional, and then how that then leverages globally. Africa is having tough conversations amongst itself. Africa is talking about its debt. We've seen the framework that they've come up with through the G20 and also the debt framework with the AU. These are conversations Africa is having itself to say, how do we navigate this process? There are
Mm.
bilateral agreements, there are, regional agreements, and then it is looking out. It is saying Southeast Asia, it is saying Europe, it's saying North America. It's going where it needs to go to progress. Okay. It might not be perfect. It might not be the linear multilateral system that we are used to, but I like that
Um,
agency. I'd like to see it across more countries. It's emerging. I'd like to see it across more and more and more countries.
Did you see our work on circular cooperation ever, Mavis? That concept of circular cooperation that we're developing, because it very much links to what you were saying about
No.
would the African
Hmm.
countries go to the Europeans for a whole bunch of particular technical advice. I mean, that's clearly true. I always think of all of the kind of conflict advisors that have kind of learnt about
Uh-huh.
conflict on their conflict MA, or MPhil. Like, and I've been living in Colombia forever, and I'm like, Colombians, you
Hmm.
should be going out and doing technical advice on conflict
Yeah,
resolution because you guys know about it.
exactly.
We did have Northern
Hmm.
Ireland in the UK, which was a conflict
Yeah.
from that.
Hmm.
So it's like for us,
Yeah.
global
Yeah.
north, the place where you get a lot of technical advice. But we, with our circular cooperation kind of thinking, have taken it another step forward, and we've said actually the African continent and the Latin American continent and Asian continent should be giving technical advice to the global north. Where are the African consultants?
That's not bad.
Where are the
Yeah.
African consultants flying north to Manchester, to Berlin,
Hmm.
to Wales, to
Yeah.
the south of France to engage them in what you can offer, in terms of
Yeah.
human rights,
Yeah.
women's rights, children's rights, mental health,
Hmm.
sustainable development, all those kind of things. So it's kind for us, it's the next, almost possibly
Hmm.
the final theoretical step in international development is breaking
Hmm.
down this north-south thing and just saying everyone should be offering technical advice to everyone because everyone's got
Exactly.
knowledge, right?
But Jonathan, you see, this is where the issue is, but Africans are providing that support. And I think this, for me, is often one of the fundamental weaknesses in the development discourse. When we talk about Africa, and we talk about Africa's development, we talk about, the 40% of poor people or the 10% of kids not in school or the health mechanisms that are not working. Nobody ever talks about the African expert who is sitting in NASA. Okay. Nobody ever talks about the African expert who is sitting in Treasury. Nobody talks about those people because those people are not Africans. Of course, they're Africans. They're either first generation Africans or they are second or third generation Africans. But those Africans, because of the nature of our culture and system, can walk into most African countries and collect a passport. Okay. So African technical advice is in Europe and North America already. Only nobody sees it. It's there. Oh, actually, let me rephrase that. Nobody sees it until it becomes a problem and something goes wrong. Then everybody sees it.
And
But when it's working.
but agree. And American advice, again, taking it back to the continent I know so well, there's plenty of examples.
Mhm.
And the Brazilian social programs are the
Yeah.
best examples, probably, of programs that
Mhm.
have indeed been exported and shared across the world. But it's just not institutionalized. Like the
Exactly.
institutions of international development
Mhm.
still talk about North consultants going to generally fly south,
Mhm.
generally share, whereas we should have
Mhm.
developed that by now. I just want to take you back to one of the things you said about mutual interest, because that really has been a key
Mhm.
theme in a lot of these conferences, and people are kind of getting it.
Mhm.
But you also, I think, quite rightly said that it's not. It can mean lots of different things, and I think it's quite a
Mhm.
provocative term at the moment. I think a lot of people see the
Mhm.
mutual interest language as an excuse for the global north to kind of follow quite a simplistic transactional approach,
Mhm.
which I think is what you were implying.
Mhm.
But how do you see that? I mean, certainly the work that we've done together and the work that we're now doing, especially in global public investment,
No.
the concept that we're all in this together is the basis of 21st century cooperation. It's very
Mhm.
different to the kind of 20th century we help you. So it
Mhm.
does feel like a step forward, but it also feels like quite a dangerous one that can lead to transactionalism if we're not
Mhm.
careful.
Okay. So the first one is that the reason I'm saying that it's a good thing is that the world is being honest. Okay. Because, Jonathan, you and I have worked in this business long enough to know there wasn't a penny that didn't come with some kind of conditionality. Okay. And when the UK first cut its aid and when the US pulled the rug last year, okay, actually a lot of the outcry did not come from the continent. It came from Europe and North America because that's where the bulk of the money was spent. And that's where the immediate hit was. I mean, let's call it spade a spade. Okay. So I think one of the things I like about it is the honesty. It's we are doing this because it's not just about us. It's not just about you anymore. It's about all of us. Okay. So I like the honesty in it. I think it could be transactional if you're not careful. But this is when I then put the onus on my leaders. Okay. I'm like, you can't use power dynamics, you can't use history not to hold your own. All right. If you are serious about development and you are serious and you say this is about mutual interest, truly define what you mean by mutual interest. So, when if you are Morocco, all right, and Southern Europe wants your labor at a certain time of the year, okay, it's mutual interest. It's fine. Okay, they provide you with some support in the form of development assistance. You don't just send your laborers there to be exploited. Mutual interest means you negotiate a price point that benefits your leaders, your laborers, a price point that takes into account the fact that they're seasonal labor, okay, an agreement for standards for that labor. What happens when they return? What is the cycle? Negotiate for 5 years. So if I'm a worker in Morocco and I know I will be picking, I don't know, berries in Italy for the next 5 years, I know I'm going to earn this much. I know how I'm planning. And it's my countries are negotiating. It's not mutual interest. Let's give you TA, send your laborers, we exploit them, send them back. They get frustrated, they get on boats. That's not mutual interest. So if we are serious about mutual interest, the onus is on both sides to negotiate effectively. So for me, it doesn't it of course it's transactional. Jonathan, if I was still in Her Majesty's government, even with my Ghanaian, even with my Ghanaian inheritance, I would be negotiating for UK's mutual interest because
Mm,
that's who pays my salary.
mm,
So mutual interest is a two-way process. And I think often we use power dynamics as the excuse. I think that's just laziness.
mm.
Power dynamics should not be excused. You are both leaders of your country. You have both been voted in. Yes, your systems are tough, but when you go to the table, push for what you want and be confident enough that if the French will not give it to you, trust me, the Germans will. Be confident enough to fight for it. That would
Or
be my
probably the
argument.
Chinese. So, which, by the way, is a relevant
Exactly.
factor, isn't it? I mean, the fact that there is now a massive
Mm-hmm.
different center of power for Africans to negotiate
Mm-hmm.
with really does affect
Exactly.
Africans' ability, Africa's ability to manage
Mm-hmm.
this situation. I remember when China started giving large
Mm-hmm.
amounts of money to Ethiopia or investing,
Mm-hmm.
and Meles were just like, this is what changed the game. The fact that I was able to say no to
Yes.
that lot because I could say yes to that lot
Mm-hmm.
enabled me to be a
Mm-hmm.
much more powerful African leader. And I wonder if
Mm-hmm.
that's one example, but it
Mm-hmm.
does feel like the power of African leaders is there for the taking now in a way that it just wasn't in the 90s.
Mhm.
Like, they were great leaders,
I
but
agree.
they didn't have the economic
Hmm.
political heft behind them to
Hmm.
actually seriously negotiate. And now they seem like they can, and that's surely a huge difference now.
I think it's huge. I mean, one, they have the heft to negotiate, because they have a lot the world wants. Okay. Two, they have the technical experts to call on. You don't have to go to, dare I say it, Oxford or Harvard or
Or the
whatever.
bank.
Those institutions have trained enough of your own,
Yeah.
okay, for you to go to them for advice. So it's a no-brainer. So that would be my argument.
I guess, the Donald Trump grenade has been thrown. Everything is
Mhm.
exploding around our eyes. Some of that can
Mhm.
be quite devastating, quite obviously, and it's really dangerous to be glib about
Mhm.
possibilities emerging from this moment, because there's obviously so
Mhm.
much that's kind of very, very terrible that's happening. But
Mhm.
do you feel optimistic about Africa's future at the moment? And is
Mhm.
is it related to the fact that things have been thrown open,
Mhm.
in this way? I mean, we're having these discussions in these conferences in a way that probably we wouldn't have done had,
Mhm.
Donald
Mhm.
not turned up.
So, Jonathan, I think what's happened is that, it's very easy for us to all just kind of focus on Trump because it was just so brutal and so quick. Like he came in and he ripped the plaster off. Let's be honest. People had been slowly peeling it. It wasn't like he just came and said, "This is too hard," and pulled it off and
The
went
front
his way.
cover of my first book was actually a plaster. I don't know if you've read my book, Mavis, you probably
Uh-huh.
have. But
No,
the
I haven't. No.
actually really good cover. It was a plaster in the
Yeah.
shape of Africa.
Hmm.
I'll send you a photo after this. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Okay. So, the UK had been pulling it off slowly, the Swedes, the Dutch, the Germans, everybody had been peeling. And, you know, we were all quietly talking about the pain of it. But the time meant that I'd say less African countries, but more, INGOs and global institutions we're adjusting slowly but surely to the shift, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. But then, Donald Trump, he's not, I don't know him to call him Donald, but Donald Trump came in and said,
Mm.
rip it off. And I think we have all concentrated on that element, but we need to have the conversation more broadly. The fact that development assistance has been declining slowly and to a degree quite rapidly over the last decade. It's been just going down and down and down. Okay. So I would say, firstly, maybe we didn't focus enough on the cuts as a continent in the early stages, and we should have. And I think often the reason we didn't focus on the cuts is that we've been here before and the money's gone back up again. Remember the days when it got cut and then it goes back to point 0.7 and then we go to point 0.5. Then we've been, and so there was a part of people that felt that it would go back up. I think what happened last year, compounded with the UK's cuts and Germany's cuts, etc., people are beginning to maybe think it might not go back again. Okay. So that's the first thing. And that in itself, for me, is I don't think it's a good thing, Jonathan. And I don't think it's a bad thing either. The reason I don't think it's a good thing is while some countries have been able to plug the gap, we don't actually know the real impact of this because so much of it was off book. Okay. And we don't have the data. And so until something like, DRC and Ebola happens or whatever the next crisis is going to happen in some village, we actually don't know how much our health and education and social systems were shored up by NGOs. That's risky. And that
Yeah.
really worries me because I think we're going to see deaths, hopefully not in large numbers, but that's what's going to make us realize how little we knew about what was being done off book. So that's the first thing.
Mhm.
That for me is the bad thing. I think the good thing in this is countries are now saying, okay, we have been for too long, commissioning out our development. And maybe it's time for us to look in-house and not hand over our data systems to, you know, the Americans and not hand over our health system to the Brits and not, countries are now starting to actually see the danger, okay, in letting others drive essential parts of your country. And
Mhm.
and that in itself is a good thing because what it's now doing is that they're getting them to say, where do we get the money from? Okay. And they're being a bit smarter. At the AFDB meetings, the Brits announced a 250 million guarantee facility support as part of NAFAD. Okay. Love it. I love the fact that the president of the African Development Bank sees an opportunity and grabs it and goes with it, makes it work for us. I love it. Okay. I want to see more of that. I want to see more countries. It's a transaction for the Brits, and they can go back and say, we are investing, we're doing this great for the Brits. But we also we need a guarantee facility to help us grow our economies. There's a platform, grab it. I'm loving the fact that it's forcing us to think out of the box around the instruments and opportunities that we use and how we engage with our partners.
Can I just ask you one last question before we kind of bring it to a close? And it's kind of something that you raised just right at the beginning of this conversation. And you're a British African or an African Brit. I'm not sure which way round, but you've certainly kind of straddled the two continents in your life. And it
Mhm,
feels like a really, you know, moment of possibility maybe for Africa with all the challenges, of course, but
mhm,
certainly a feeling of possibility if countries are able to get it right.
mhm.
But then back in Britain, how worried are you about the politics of Britain and Europe and the global North, which of course matter deeply
Mhm.
to Africa and other continents?
Yeah.
What happens on those continents in Europe and North America is going to impact, it already is and will impact hugely on African continents, but also matter
Mhm,
in their own right. Europe and North Americans.
mhm.
You mentioned the word rising racism earlier, rising sexism. How worried are you about that at the moment? And where do you where do you see that coming from, and what needs to be done about it?
I think the thing that really worries me as somebody who straddles both, and Jonathan, you asked me, am I British African? Am I British Ghanaian or Ghanaian British? It depends on who's upsetting me on a given day. So, and then I think it's going to be a very interesting day, football match, to see which T-shirt I wear on the day, whether the Brits will upset me the most or the Ghanaians will upset me the most in advance of that match.
I was watching years ago, there was a Colombia-England game. I was in Colombia. It went
Yeah.
down to penalties, and, penalties are
Uh-huh.
so important for the English mindset, but I was in Colombia, and it was
Yeah.
so important for the Colombians to win, and I just felt that the depth of I wanted both, and you end up I think I kinda wanted Colombia to win more in the end. I don't know, I think I tried betrayed my own country, but I mean, yeah, that's when you really find out what you're thinking at the time, or where your
I
allegiance
know,
is.
but it's really scary. When you have children who are both and really both, because one half of the parent is it's English and the other half is Ghanaian, imagine what happens to them, especially when the two parents are fighting on the football match. But look, on a more serious note, I think I having straddled both, the thing that worries me, I would say, is the immaturity of the engagement. Okay. Like there's always been this sense of ordinary citizens don't understand. I think ordinary citizens don't understand issues if you present it to them in very complex language. Okay. Which we all like to do. We all like to be clever and whatever. Okay. But if we're looking at the issues in Britain right now, okay, the UK is an aging population. Okay. It requires skills that it doesn't have at the moment. Okay. Skills that it can import if it's strategic about it. It requires it requires a partnership with countries that will enable it to be reasonably balanced. It has capabilities to be able to share with others. Okay. But it feels very much like there is this battle of nationalism and regression because of
Mm.
certain political elements, which is forcing other political elements that you would hope to be more balanced not to be balanced. Okay. And that worries me. That worries me a lot because I don't see this. Look, Jonathan, I am struck every time I'm traveling between Europe and African countries, how many children of the diaspora float in and out of the
Mm.
two. That next generation, they are neither British or Ghanaian or Ethiopian and German or whatever. They are not. They are both. They belong to both, like I do.
Mm.
Okay. And I think that if we could be more mature to see real mutual benefit, to build real mutual benefit agreements.
Mm.
Hey, maybe I'm naive. I don't think I'm naive.
Mm.
I know the challenges we are dealing in. Some of the counties are really tough, but those challenges are driven by I don't have a job. My farm is going down the train. It's this, it's that. The farm is going down because we won't go into Brexit, but that's another story. There are so many fundamental challenges, but at the same time, you have an aging population. If you don't import nurses, if you don't import care workers, how are you going to look after that aging population?
Mm.
And
Robots.
a robot, I hadn't thought about it. Have we built it yet?
It's Chinese. Um, don't worry. So it's so interesting. The lens of immaturity, I think, is a really interesting one. I hadn't really
Mhm,
put it like that, but I think you're right. And then on the one hand,
mm,
you've got an element of forced, finally maturity in some ways. If you look at
mhm,
Carney's famous Davos speech, he was kind of forced into
mhm,
maturity,
mhm.
to use your words, kind of,
Yeah.
finally
Mhm,
accepting a reality that really
mhm,
we had deliberately, I
mhm,
think we, the global north, deliberately kind of covering up. And yet, on the other hand, there's this massive immaturity. You just got to go to the country south of Carney to see this
mhm,
crazy level of immaturity in
mhm.
politics. A weird mix of honesty and
Jonathan, I
massive
think, but you
difficulty.
know what, Jonathan, I I honestly think sometimes in the world of development, because we do north, south, global minority, global majority, we kind of put everything in that box. Okay. But I actually don't think it is that straightforward. If you look at a lot of the pushback that we are seeing in the global minority countries, okay, it is a very hard journey for what is predominantly the working class white man, okay, who feels marginalized, isolated, not as powerful. And his attack isn't just on migrants, his attack is on women. His attack is on a system that he feels has marginalized him. And then it grows and grows and grows and grows. And, when you talk in the gender space, it's a gender issue. When you talk in the development space, it is a migration issue. When you talk in the political, do you see what I mean? And it's a really complicated system. We are talking about a world where young boys are sitting in chat rooms, okay, feeling that's how they get their masculinity. Okay, we need, how are we helping to demystify toxic masculinity and still help young men feel that we can build a world of shared power. Okay. It's not about women's empowerment. It's not about Black empowerment. It's about shared power where we all bring our respective strengths to the table. How do we build that well? And I think
Mm.
the challenge is everybody is regressing into their comfort zone
Mm.
and fighting from that comfort zone because we don't know how to have that conversation. It's if I might digress, as you know, I recently got bereaved and a friend of mine got bereaved. And when I met her, I said to her, do you know, I'm gonna ask you that question that really annoyed me when Tim went, which is, how are you doing? But I'm gonna ask it because we don't have any other language to check in. And so the two of us sat there and started um having a conversation around what language can we use. And she said, maybe if you'd come in and say, could you do with a hug right now? I'd have probably said yes, and that would have been enough for me. So it's about learning new language to navigate this complex space we find ourselves in so we don't all feel we're going to be losers, because I think that's what's causing this right now. Everybody is afraid they are losing on this journey, and actually I don't think it's that black and white.
That's a good pun. I mean, I so agree with you, and I think it's the best aspects of the language of liberation, be it and I want to write a piece. I'd love to bring you into it, maybe like on bringing back the language of liberation. It was so powerful in the 60s and 70s, whether it's
Mm,
women's
mhm,
liberation, African liberation.
mhm,
And the best aspects of
mhm.
that, it wasn't just liberating for the peoples that were oppressed. It was liberating for the
Yeah.
oppressed as well. Women's liberation,
Yes. Yeah.
that wasn't the point, but it was brackets also the point. And it feels like,
Yes.
I totally agree with you. It feels like we've regressed to kind of everyone defend their position rather than a mutual liberation
Mm-hmm.
from the kind of shackles of simple immature 20th century
Yeah.
kind of sexism, racism divides.
Mm-hmm.
And well, that's really made me
But
think.
isn't there also a part of it that has to do with unnecessary wealth? I've been thinking a lot. One of the things that your guys were saying to me was, were asking me is, what have I been reading lately? And I was just been thinking as I was reflecting on that question. And I thought to myself, we live in a world where I almost feel a little bit like we've regressed into old school feudalism, you know. Handful of people are so ridiculously wealthy,
Mm,
okay?
mm,
And protecting that wealth against all odds,
mm,
okay? And then we live in this media world where nobody's challenging the world but aspiring to be that wealthy. But that level of wealth and inequality is creating so many problems in the world. And I was thinking about, I was like, my God, I feel like we've gone back in time. All we need to do is replace those wealthy men and women with titles of kings and queens. And, it's like, it's a
exactly, that
problem.
is.
So I honestly think, Jonathan, the question you're asking me around these tensions between global north, global south, global majority, global minority, I think it's a conversation that we are having in development. Okay. If you go into those countries, you will see different types of conversations, like with different issues at the heart of it.
Yeah.
What's happening is the bottom line across the world is something really simple. We don't have enough decent jobs. And as a result, we don't have robust livelihoods for enough people.
Mm,
And that is causing a tension across the board, whether you are sitting in Britain or you are sitting in Togo.
mm,
That's what we're dealing with. End of. It's
mm,
just playing out in different ways.
mm. Well, I think that's quite a good summary at the end there. It's this nervousness about what the future holds for our kids.
Hmm.
And that I think is
Yeah.
true, just as you said, whether it's in Britain or Togo or anywhere. So that's a really good way to
Hmm.
end. Thank you very
Hmm.
much. It's been fascinating to talk to you. So good to catch up. And I hope our listeners will have
Likewise,
super
Jonathan.
interesting, different perspectives, and really how different
Mhm.
things are from when we set out, like in the late 90s, with some
Yes.
real possibilities, but also some real fears for the future that, I guess that's what we're
Hmm.
working to respond to. So good luck with everything, Mavis.
But
See you soon at one.
Jonathan, can I just say one thing to your listeners? So I know this probably hasn't been like a traditional conversation with Jonathan, but no conversation with Jonathan is ever traditional between me and you. But I think the one thing I would say is if you are embarking on international development or you're embarking on any kind of development project, okay, be really clear on what your value is and why you're coming into this business because it's murky, it's complex, it's hard work. But the thing that we find is that it's honest conversations like the one Jonathan and I have just had that keeps us incentivized to keep pushing on. Because at the end of the day, we have one common interest in this business, a better world for every human being, irrespective of the lottery of birth. And if you believe in that, you can navigate it. In the 1990s and early noughties, we thought the world was coming to an end. And look at the great things the world achieved in the first 20 something years. And then we've just hit another brick wall. We'll come through it. Fingers crossed. But only if we keep having these conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mavis. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.